Good morning on this last Sunday in March 2021. This year is just ticking away day by day, week by week, and now we're going to get into the fourth month already. It was the last Sunday in March a year ago when we had our first online Sunday school lesson. What I thought at that time would be 3 or 4 Sundays has turned into a full orbit around the sun. And some of you I know have tuned in to every one of those lessons. And I appreciate that you have. But more so, I pray, and I do pray every week before I start preparing the lessons that I would make sense and that it would be valuable and usable to the people who listen. And I hope that you have gained some valuable insights into how God planned for us to apply his teachings to our lives. If we don't do that, then we just listen to a nice little story. So I hope that all the lessons have been applicable in some fashion. And that's my prayer every week before I start. Anyway, our lesson for today is session 4 in the quarterly, if you have that. And if you follow along in the Bible, it's going to be from Luke chapter 19. The lesson doesn't begin with verse 1 in chapter 19, so I'd like to summarize a little bit about the verses prior to the lesson. As you know, Jesus was traveling to Jerusalem, and you know he was on a specific mission. But he continued to teach and to minister to the people along the way. And, I've told my Sunday school class and the choir members that I have a very one-track mind. And if I happen to pass you by and I don't speak, or I don't maybe even hear you or recognize you, please don't be offended, because it's because I'm focused on my mission. I've got a mission, I'm headed somewhere, and I've got that on my mind and for that particular moment, and may not even realize that I'm crossing paths with you. But in my head would be whatever it is that I've set out to do. And I'm operating in tunnel vision. I've got that in my mind. But Jesus wasn't like that. He was on a mission to Jerusalem, but he stopped along the way. He told parables. He took opportunities to teach his disciples and to try to correct the Pharisees that questioned him. And he healed the sick. He even raised some from the dead. But as he was entering Jericho, he met Zacchaeus. Now, all the children know Zacchaeus. He was a wee little man was he, and he climbed up in a sycamore tree. And actually, he was a short man. He was a wealthy tax collector, and he wanted to see Jesus, so he did run ahead of the crowd, and he climbed a tree so that he would be able to see him as the crowd passed by. But much to his surprise, Jesus stopped at the base of the tree, and he called Zacchaeus by name, and he told him to come down, and he also announced that he was going to be going to his house that day. Now, that statement blew the minds of the Pharisees in the crowd, because once again, Jesus was going to be the guest of a sinner. And they had already reprimanded Jesus about that, about associating with sinners. But on this occasion, on this day, Zacchaeus was a changed man. And then Jesus told a parable of 10 minas. Now, a nobleman, which represented Jesus, was going away from his land to be crowned king. And a lot of people didn't like him and didn't want him to be the king. But before he left, he gave some servants 10 minas. That was about 3 months' wages. And he told them to put the money to work so when he returned as the king, there would be more. He did return as the king, and he called for the servants and their reports. One servant had doubled his amount. One increased by 50%, and one hid his to keep it safe, and there was no increase. Now, these servants represented the followers of Jesus, which would have been any followers of that day, but followers of today as well. And they had all been given a commission, just as we are, and that would be to tell others. And those who increased their minas were rewarded. Those were the ones that had told people about Jesus, and they were rewarded according to the work that they had done. The reward of the one who did not make any gain In other words, he had nothing to give to the king. His was given to the servant who had worked hard and had gained the most. Now, those who did not like this man and did not accept him as the king when he returned were brought to death. So, this was actually a parable that told about Jesus leaving his place, leaving here, and leaving people in charge of telling others and being able to present some to him when he returned as the king. And for those who did not believe, then that was their reward. They got no reward. So now that brings us to the first verses for today, which would be chapter 19. We're going to start in verses 29 through 31. As he approached Bethphage, I think that's the way you say it, Bethphage, and Bethany, at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said, "Go into the village ahead of you. As you enter it, you will find a coat tied there, on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' say this, 'The Lord needs it.'" After leaving Jericho, Jesus traveled toward the 2.5 mile ridge on the eastern side of Jerusalem, known as the Mount of Olives. He stopped in or near two communities known as Bethphage and Bethany. The Mount of Olives rose about 200 feet above the city of Jerusalem, so you might imagine what Jesus was thinking or how he felt maybe as he looked down on that city from that viewpoint, knowing that in about a week he would face the cross. Bethany, which was about 2 miles from Jerusalem, was the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Now, Luke didn't record it in his writings, but Matthew, Mark, and John told of Jesus having a meal at the home of Simon the leper as he passed through Bethany about 6 days before the Passover. And Lazarus was present at that feast, and people knew that Jesus had raised him from the dead, so there was a crowd gathered there to see that. And while he was in the area of these two villages, Jesus instructed two of his disciples to do something that seemed fairly unusual. They were to go into the village that was ahead of them, and many believe that it was Bethphage, since it was closer to Jerusalem. And they were to secure a donkey. Actually, all they had to do was go get the donkey. It evidently had already been secured. And they would find him tied, and they were to untie him and bring the animal back to Jesus. If the owner or if anyone asked them why they were untying the animal, then they were to simply say, "The Lord needs it." Well, the colt was to be a young one that had never been ridden. Any animal that was used for holy purposes would be one that had not been used for any kind of common task. So, and that was customary, but the disciples who were being sent and who also were not named may not have thought anything about this particular part of their instructions at the time, that this was to be one that had not been used. But it probably was more significant to them after Jesus' death and resurrection, for then they would have understood that the animal they went to get was used for a holy purpose. It was not clear if the plan to secure the colt was prearranged, but it was clear that it was a fulfilling of prophecies that the Messiah would ride a young donkey into Jerusalem. In Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, it says, "See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Now, our next scriptures are verses 32 through 36. So I'm going to turn the page and get to those. So those who were sent left and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners said to them, "Why are you untying the colt? The Lord needs it," they said. Then they brought it to Jesus. Oh, excuse me. And after throwing their clothes on the colt, they helped Jesus get on it. As he was going along, they were spreading their clothes on the road. It appears the task given to these two disciples was a pretty lowly task. I mean, walk into a village and bring back a donkey. But every task assigned by Jesus is a holy task. Some are huge, some are public, some are small, some are private, but all are God given tasks and they're all important. And we may do well to remember that as we go about doing our godly chores or the ones that God has called us to do, the talents that God has given us to use for His purpose, the big ones and the small ones. What was impressive to me and should be to everyone else is the fact that the disciples didn't question why they were doing this. They simply obeyed without question of what Jesus instructed. They showed that showed a major trust in him. And so many times we think that we need to know all the whys and all the hows in situations, and we need to know the end result before we begin and before we even make a move. And when we really and truly just need to trust and obey God's commands. They went into the village and events happened just like Jesus had told them they might happen. They found a tied donkey and they were asked why they were untying it, and they answered exactly as they had been instructed. They brought the animal back to Jesus. They threw their outer garments onto its back for safety of the animal and for Jesus. There was no saddle. They gave Jesus a foothold to get on the donkey, and there he sat, ready to complete the journey into Jerusalem. He began moving down the slope as others in the group, the disciples and the followers traveling with them, threw their garments on the ground, and some of them cut branches from the trees to pave the way for Jesus to come into the city. And there were a lot of people gathered and traveling to Jerusalem because it was the Passover feast, and that was celebrated once a year, and the Jews made a very concentrated effort to attend the week-long festivals. If you remember, Mary and Joseph made that trip along with Jesus when he was young every year. So not only did the people make way for Jesus coming into Jerusalem that day, but they also cheered and praised God, as we will see in the next scriptures, which will be verses 37 and 38. Now he came near the path down the Mount of Olives, and the whole crowd of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. So many in the crowd that followed along had witnessed miracles, and others had just heard of the miracles performed by Jesus. But I'm sure there were many there that hadn't witnessed, but they were curious. But think about all the miracles that had happened up to this point. Blind people had gained their sight. Lame people had begun to walk. Lepers were cleansed. Demons had been cast out, and dead ones had been raised to life. What reasons to cheer? And that's what the entire crowd was doing. And they were praising God with loud voices. They did not care who heard them. Maybe it sounded like one of the football games when a touchdown is made. But the hearts of the disciples must have been overflowing with joy as the Messiah, their teacher, and their friend got closer to the city. After all, they had spent the past 3 years with him. Day after day, they were learning from him and they were following his leadership. They had to feel proud when these people cheered him along. And it's true that many believed the prophesied Messiah would be coming to restore Israel and get them from under the Roman rule, or also from being oppressed by Babylon or Assyria or other nations around. And they thought that Israel would become a powerful nation again. That was what they thought the Messiah. A lot of people thought that. And they didn't understand that the kingdom that Jesus would usher in was of a different sort and of a different time. But you can just hear in your mind the excitement that was in the air as they shouted about the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Yet not everyone present on that occasion felt the joy and the enthusiasm that the crowd expressed. And we'll see that in the next verses 39 through 40. Some of the Pharisees from the crowd told him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." He answered, I tell you, if they were to keep silent, the stones would cry out. Now, some of the Pharisees were slowly beginning to understand the teachings of Jesus, so we can't group them all into a lump sum of an evil category. That's just what some of us do today with our various prejudices. We just put everybody in the same group, and that's not the way we should think. But many of the Pharisees, most of the Pharisees, still opposed Jesus, and they did not like all of the cheering and the hullabaloo on his behalf. And not only did they speak to Jesus about the crowd cheering, but they wanted him to stop them, not just lower the volume. They wanted him to reject their assertions about him being the one who comes in the name of the Lord. He answered firmly and bluntly, and I don't believe he raised his voice. He just spoke with authority. In times past, he wanted his disciples to keep to themselves his true identity. And even sometimes when he would heal someone, he would say, don't tell anybody. But now the time had come for everyone to know. So Jesus was welcoming the cheers from the crowd that declared that he was God's Messiah. If the people did not recognize him, the creation would cry out for them. Inanimate creation will testify the truth when there is no one else to speak it. Those religious leaders may not have accepted Jesus as their king, but the stones on which their temple was built did. The kingship of Jesus is a reality, whether people recognize it or not, at that time and at this time. On that occasion, he was accepting the praises of the people because with that acceptance, he was claiming his divinity. Jesus is not only worthy of our praise, their praise, our praise, he is the only one worthy of our worship. We were not there that day, but we are still expected to declare him as the Son of God and this only Savior that we have. We worship him with our time, our talents, and our treasures. At least I hope that's what all believers do. Give your time, your talents, and your treasures. And during this season, before Easter Sunday, it's just a great time that we could renew our love and our loyalty and our hearts in appreciation of that death on the cross just a few days after this account of this part of the story of Easter. So I want to thank you today for joining in once more, and I hope you'll do it again. And I pray that everybody stays safe, that we help keep others safe, and please pray for the church and for our country. Keep it in your prayers because we certainly need it so much. And I thank you, and I hope you'll join again.